The bullet grazed his shoulder as he dove behind the overturned wagon. And in that moment, as hot blood soaked through his shirt in the Arizona Territory dust of 1882, Jack Thornton realized he had forgotten what another person's touch felt like. 5 years had passed since he let anyone close enough to matter. 5 years since the fever took his wife and infant son. 5 years since he rode away from everything he knew and became a ghost drifting through mining camps and cattle towns. Now, bleeding and alone on a desert road 20 miles from Tombstone, he pressed his own calloused hand against the wound and wondered if this was how his story would end. The bandits had moved on, thinking him dead or close enough to it. The sun hammered down mercilessly, turning the air thick and shimmering. Jack's vision blurred at the edges as he stumbled to his feet, leaving dark drops in the sand behind him. His horse had bolted during the gunfight, taking his canteen and supplies with it. The smart thing would be to lie down in whatever shade he could find and wait for the inevitable. But Jack Thornton had not survived 5 years of deliberate isolation by being smart. He had survived by being stubborn. He walked, one foot then the other. The wound in his shoulder burned like a branding iron, but he kept moving because moving meant he was still alive, and being alive meant he had not yet failed completely at this punishment he had assigned himself. He did not deserve comfort. He did not deserve companionship. He had failed to save his family, and so he would walk alone until the desert or his memories finally claimed him. The wagon appeared like a mirage in the distance, a dark shape against the endless expanse of sand and scrub brush. Jack blinked hard, certain it would vanish, but it remained solid as he approached. A single covered wagon, one wheel broken, listing to the side like a wounded animal, no horses, no movement. Another abandoned dream on the road west. Then he heard her voice, clear and strong despite the circumstances. "If you are planning to rob me, sir, I should inform you that bandits already beat you to it. However, if you are planning to help, I would be extraordinarily grateful." Jack rounded the wagon and found her sitting in the thin shade it provided. A young woman with auburn hair escaping from a practical bun, her dress torn at the hem, dust coating her face. She held a rifle across her lap, pointed in his general direction but not quite at him. Her hands were steady even though her situation was clearly desperate. "I am not much help to anyone," Jack said, his voice rough from disuse. He talked to his horse sometimes and to bartenders when necessary, but real conversation had become foreign to him. "Got shot myself about 2 miles back." Her eyes widened as she took in the blood staining his shirt, the rifle lowered. "Lord have mercy, sit down before you fall down." "I am fine." "You are bleeding all over the desert and swaying like a drunk. Sit." There was command in her voice, the kind that came from someone used to being obeyed. Jack found his legs folding under him before he quite decided to comply. She moved quickly, tearing strips from her already damaged petticoat. "My name is Eleanor Marsh. I was traveling with a family heading to California, but our group was attacked yesterday. They took the horses, most of the supplies, and shot poor Mr. Henderson when he tried to stop them. The others went for help, but that was yesterday morning and no one has returned." "Jack Thornton," he said, because manners had been drilled into him as a boy and even 5 years of isolation had not completely eroded them. He flinched when she reached for his shirt. "I can do it." "You can barely lift your arm. Let me help." Her fingers touched his hand, gently moving it aside, and Jack's entire body went rigid. The sensation of another person's skin against his was so foreign, so intimate after all this time, that it felt like an electric shock. He jerked back instinctively. Eleanor paused, her brown eyes meeting his with unexpected understanding. "I am sorry. I should have warned you. May I look at your wound? I promise to be as quick as possible." Jack nodded stiffly, not trusting his voice. She worked efficiently, unbuttoning his shirt enough to expose the injury. Her touch was clinical, impersonal, but to Jack it felt monumental. Each brush of her fingers was an earthquake, a reminder that he was still human, still capable of sensation, still connected to the world he had tried so hard to leave behind. "The bullet went through," Eleanor said, relief evident in her tone. "That is fortunate. It needs to be cleaned and bound, but you should heal if infection does not set in." She worked as she spoke, using water from a small canteen to clean the wound. Jack clenched his jaw against the pain, watching her face instead of what she was doing. She had a determined set to her mouth, a small scar above her left eyebrow, and freckles scattered across her nose like stars. "Why are you alone?" Jack asked, partly to distract himself from the sensation of her hands on his bare skin. "If the others went for help yesterday, why did you stay?" "Someone had to guard what little remains of our supplies," Eleanor said practically. "Besides, I am not particularly good at walking long distances in the heat. I have always been rather stubborn about acknowledging my limitations, but 20 miles in this sun seemed inadvisable." She tied off the bandage with practiced efficiency. "There, that should hold." "Thank you." The words felt inadequate. Jack buttoned his shirt with shaking fingers, grateful to have a barrier between them again. "Your group may not be coming back." "I had begun to suspect that," Eleanor said dryly, "which is why your arrival, while not ideal given your injury, is nonetheless welcome. Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then I propose we walk together." Tombstone cannot be more than 15 or 20 miles from here, and walking in the evening once the sun goes down would be safer than staying here. "We have a little water and I managed to hide some food from the bandits. We should manage." Jack wanted to refuse. He wanted to explain that he could not be responsible for another person, that everyone he cared for ended up dead, that he was poison to anyone who got close. But Eleanor was already repacking her hidden supplies, her movements brisk and purposeful, and the words died in his throat. She needed help. He could provide it. Once they reached Tombstone, he would disappear again into the vast emptiness he had made his home. They waited for sunset, rationing water and sitting in silence. Eleanor did not press him with questions or attempt to make conversation, which Jack appreciated more than she could know. She seemed content in her own thoughts, occasionally adjusting her makeshift bandage on his shoulder with detached competence. Each time she touched him, even through his shirt, Jack felt that same jolt of awareness, that reminder of connection he had denied himself for so long. When the sun finally began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they set out. Jack carried the rifle and what supplies he could manage with his injured shoulder. Eleanor walked beside him, her stride determined despite the obvious difficulty of navigating rough terrain in inappropriate shoes. They did not speak much at first, focusing their energy on covering ground before darkness fell completely. "Tell me something," Eleanor said after an hour of walking. "How does a man end up alone on a desert road getting shot by bandits? That seems like a story worth hearing." "It is not." Jack kept his eyes on the horizon, tracking the gradually fading light. "I have always believed that the stories people claim are not worth telling are precisely the ones that need to be heard," Eleanor replied. "But I will not pry. Instead, I will tell you my story, and perhaps you will feel inspired to reciprocate." She talked as they walked, her voice steady and warm in the gathering darkness. She had been a teacher in Philadelphia, Eleanor explained, engaged to a banker's son who seemed appropriate on paper but inspired no particular passion in her heart. When her father died suddenly, leaving debts she had not known existed, her engagement had been quietly dissolved. The banker's son, it seemed, had been more interested in her expected inheritance than in Eleanor herself. "I decided that if I was going to be poor and alone, I might as well be poor and alone somewhere with better weather and more opportunities." Eleanor said with a wry humor that made Jack's mouth twitch toward a smile. So I joined a group heading west, planning to find work as a teacher in California. That plan has obviously encountered some obstacles. Obstacles, Jack repeated. That is one word for it. What word would you use? Complete disaster. Eleanor laughed, a bright sound in the darkness. Fair enough, though I maintain hope that this particular disaster can be salvaged. After all, I met you, did I not? And you have not left me to die in the desert, which sets you apart from several other people I could name. They walked through the night, stopping occasionally to rest and sip water. The desert was cold after dark, the temperature plummeting from the day's brutal heat. Jack noticed Eleanor shivering and without thinking removed his coat, draping it over her shoulders. You are injured, she protested. You need this. I am accustomed to the cold, take it. Their fingers brushed as she adjusted the coat, and again Jack felt that electric awareness. How had he forgotten this? The simple human contact that came with living among others, the casual touches that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. He had cut himself off so completely that even these innocent moments felt overwhelming. They reached Tombstone as dawn broke over the desert, both exhausted and footsore but alive. The town was already stirring, miners and cowboys and women in practical dresses moving about their morning business. Jack led Eleanor to a respectable boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson, a woman who asked no questions but accepted his money for a room for Eleanor with a knowing nod. "And where will you stay?" Eleanor asked as Mrs. Patterson retreated to prepare the room. "I have a place," Jack lied. He had been planning to sleep in a livery stable or just ride out of town entirely. "You should rest. You have been through an ordeal. We both have." Eleanor caught his hand before he could turn away, her fingers wrapping around his with gentle pressure. Jack froze, staring down at their joined hands like they were some foreign thing he could not quite comprehend. "Jack, thank you for everything. For helping me, for walking with me, for not leaving me alone. Anyone would have done the same, perhaps, but you are the one who did." She squeezed his hand once more, then released it. "Will you at least have breakfast with me? Once I have made myself presentable, I owe you that much at least." Jack knew he should refuse. He should collect his horse from wherever it had ended up, ride out of Tombstone, and return to the isolated existence he had maintained for 5 years. Eleanor Marsh was kind and brave and beautiful, and that made her dangerous in ways she could not possibly understand. He could not afford to care about anyone again. "I will be back at noon," he heard himself say. He spent the morning tracking down his horse, which had been caught by a rancher on the outskirts of town. He paid the man for his trouble and retrieved his supplies, then found a bathhouse where he could wash away the layers of dust and blood. The shoulder wound throbbed but showed no signs of infection, thanks to Eleanor's quick treatment. He bought a clean shirt from a general store, spent longer than necessary shaving and making himself presentable, and told himself he was being ridiculous the entire time. Eleanor met him in the boarding house dining room at noon, transformed from the dusty, exhausted woman he had walked through the desert with. She wore a borrowed dress that actually fit her hair properly pinned up, her face clean and radiant. She smiled when she saw him, and Jack felt something crack in the walls he had built around his heart. They ate lunch together, and Eleanor talked about her plans. She had enough money saved to continue to California if she could find another wagon train, or she could stay in Tombstone and look for teaching work. The town had children who needed education, surely. Jack listened and made non-committal sounds, trying not to think about how much he enjoyed simply sitting across from another person, sharing a meal, existing in company. "What will you do?" Eleanor asked, cutting into a piece of pie. "Where do you go from here?" "I have a claim up north," Jack said vaguely. "Mining country, I should get back to it." "Mining." Eleanor studied him with those perceptive brown eyes. "You do not seem like a miner." "What do I seem like?" "Someone who is running from something." She said it gently, without judgment. "I recognize the signs. I have been running myself after all. Though I am beginning to think that running only works for so long before you have to stop and face whatever it is you are avoiding." Jack set down his fork, his appetite suddenly gone. "Some things cannot be faced, some things can only be endured." "Perhaps," Eleanor acknowledged. "But endurance is easier with company, I have found." They talked until the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, and then Jack walked Eleanor back to her room. He knew he should leave then, should mount his horse and ride away before this tentative connection became something more substantial, something that could hurt them both. But Eleanor asked him to show her around Tombstone, to help her get her bearings in this strange new place, and Jack found himself agreeing. He told himself it was just for the afternoon. Then just for that evening, then just for one more day. A week passed, then two. Jack found work at a nearby ranch, breaking horses and mending fences, jobs that paid enough for a room at a boarding house and meals at the restaurant where Eleanor had found work as a waitress while she looked for teaching positions. They fell into an easy routine, meeting for dinner most evenings, walking through town as the desert heat faded to tolerable warmth. Jack had not intended to stay. He had not intended to let Eleanor become important to him. But she had a way of drawing him out, of asking questions that made him think and laugh and remember that he was more than just grief and guilt. She talked about books she had read, students she had taught, dreams she had for the future. She did not push him to share his past, but her patience was its own form of invitation. One evening, 3 weeks after they had stumbled into Tombstone together, they sat by a fire outside town, watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. The night was cool, and Eleanor sat close enough that Jack could feel her warmth. They had been talking about nothing in particular, the comfortable conversation of people who had grown easy with each other. "I am glad you stayed," Eleanor said softly. "These past weeks have been some of the best I have had in a long time. You have made this strange place feel less lonely." "You did that for me as well," Jack admitted. The words felt heavy, significant. "I had not realized how lonely I was until I was not anymore." Eleanor shifted, moving even closer. Jack's entire body tensed, hyper-aware of her proximity. She noticed, of course. Eleanor noticed everything. "Jack," she said gently, "you flinch every time I come near you. Every time I touch your hand or your arm, you look like you are preparing for pain." "Why?" He stared into the fire, watching flames dance and consume the dry wood. The answer was a weight he had carried alone for 5 years, and some part of him was so tired of holding it. "I had a wife," Jack said, his voice rough. "Her name was Sarah. We had a son barely 6 months old, Thomas. This was up in Colorado in a mining town called Silver Ridge. The fever came through in the winter of 1877. I was away, down in Denver buying supplies. When I got back, they were both sick. They died 3 days later. Sarah first, then Thomas. I held him as he died, and then I buried them both in frozen ground." Eleanor made a soft sound of sympathy, but she did not reach for him. She waited. "I have not let anyone close since then," Jack continued. "I have not let anyone touch me beyond what was absolutely necessary. I left Silver Ridge and I have been moving ever since, taking work where I can find it, staying nowhere long enough to form attachments. I decided that I did not deserve comfort or companionship. I failed to save them, so I would walk alone. That was my punishment, my penance." "That is not how grief works," Eleanor said softly. "That is not how love works. Sarah would not have wanted you to suffer like this. Your son would not have wanted you to be alone. You did not know them. You do not know what they would have wanted." "No. But I know what you want. I see it every time you look at me, every time you almost reach out and then stop yourself. You want connection, Jack. You want to be part of the world again. But you are afraid. Of course I am afraid, Jack said, his voice breaking. Everyone I love dies. Everyone I care about gets taken away. Why would I risk that again? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then, very slowly, she extended her hand toward him, not touching, just offering. An invitation, not a demand. Because the alternative is dying while you are still breathing, she said. Because isolation is its own kind of death, slower and colder than any fever. Because I am here and I am alive and I care about you, and I think if you are honest with yourself, you care about me too. Jack stared at her hand, pale in the firelight. Such a simple thing. Such a monumental thing. 5 years of isolation, 5 years of deliberate loneliness, 5 years of punishment for a crime he had not committed. And here was Eleanor Marsh, brave and kind and impossibly patient, offering him a way back to the world of the living. Slowly, trembling like a man facing down a loaded gun, Jack reached out and placed his hand in hers. The contact was electric, overwhelming, terrifying. Eleanor's fingers were warm and real, her palms soft against his calloused skin. She did not pull away or demand more than he could give. She simply held his hand, her thumb brushing gently across his knuckles, and let him remember what human touch felt like. Jack's breath came in shallow gasps. Tears he had not allowed himself to shed for 5 years suddenly burned in his eyes. He gripped Eleanor's hand like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to earth, and maybe she was. I am terrified, he whispered. I am so damn terrified, Eleanor. I know. She moved closer, still holding his hand until her shoulder pressed against his. I am frightened too. Every time I let myself care about someone, I risk losing them. I lost my father. I lost the future I thought I would have. I could lose you. But the alternative is never caring at all, and that seems like a worse fate to me. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, shoulders touching, watching the fire burn down to embers. Jack felt like something frozen inside him was finally beginning to thaw, painful and necessary and right. He had forgotten how to do this, how to be close to another person, but Eleanor's patient presence was teaching him again. Tell me about them, Eleanor said eventually. Tell me about Sarah and Thomas, I want to know them. And so Jack talked. He talked about how he had met Sarah at a church social in Denver, how she had laughed at his terrible attempts at dancing and agreed to marry him anyway. He talked about how excited they had been when Thomas was born, how Sarah had sung to him every night, how the baby had just started smiling right before Jack left for Denver. He talked about the guilt he carried, the what-ifs and if-onlys that had haunted him for 5 years. Eleanor listened without judgment, holding his hand through all of it. When he finally fell silent, emotionally exhausted, she leaned her head against his shoulder. They sound wonderful, she said. I am so sorry you lost them, Jack. But I am glad you had them, even for a little while. Love is worth the pain of loss. It has to be, or else what is the point of any of it? I am not sure I believe that yet, Jack admitted. But I am willing to try. That is all I ask. They stayed by the fire until it died completely, and when Jack finally walked Eleanor back to her boarding house, he held her hand the entire way. At her door, she turned to face him, her face serious in the moonlight. I care about you, Jack Thornton, she said. I am not going anywhere unless you send me away. And I should tell you now, I am very stubborn, so sending me away would require considerable effort on your part. Jack felt a smile tug at his mouth, the expression strange and wonderful after so long without reason to smile. I do not want to send you away, I just do not want to hurt you. Then do not. Choose to stay, choose to try, choose me. Eleanor rose on her toes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. Good night, Jack. She disappeared into the boarding house. leaving Jack standing in the street, his hand touching the spot where her lips had been, his heart pounding like a drum. He walked back to his own lodgings in a daze, his mind reeling with possibility and terror in equal measure. The next morning, Jack went to the small cemetery outside Tombstone. He stood among the wooden crosses and stone markers, thinking about Sarah and Thomas buried in cold Colorado, ground hundreds of miles away. He had not visited their graves since the day he buried them. He had been too afraid, too consumed by guilt and grief. "I met someone," he said aloud, feeling foolish but needing to speak the words. "Her name is Eleanor. She is smart and brave and patient with me, even though I do not deserve it. I think I am falling in love with her, and that terrifies me more than anything has in 5 years. But I do not know how to stop it. I do not know if I want to stop it." The wind whispered through the desert scrub, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Jack imagined Sarah standing beside him, her hand in his, her smile warm and understanding. "I will always love you both," he continued, "but I am so tired of being alone. I am so tired of punishing myself for something I could not control. I think Eleanor might be my chance at having a life again, a real life, and I am afraid if I do not take it, I will regret it for whatever time I have left." There was no answer, of course. But standing there in the morning sun, Jack felt a sense of peace he had not experienced in years. Sarah would have wanted him to be happy. She had been generous and loving, and she would not have wished this isolation on him. Thomas would have wanted his father to live, to love, to be whole. Jack made his decision. He found Eleanor at the restaurant during her afternoon break. She looked up from the book she was reading, her face brightening when she saw him. Before he could lose his courage, Jack crossed the room and took both her hands in his. "I want to try," he said. "I want to try being with you, having this, whatever it becomes. I am going to be difficult and probably terrible at it, but I want to try." Eleanor's smile was radiant. "You are not going to be terrible at it, and I have always enjoyed a challenge." They spent every moment they could together after that. Jack taught Eleanor to ride, borrowing a gentle mare from the ranch where he worked. She clung to him, laughing and shrieking as the horse trotted across the desert, and Jack felt joy bubble up in his chest like water from a spring. They had picnics in the shade of rock formations, exploring the strange beauty of the Arizona landscape. Eleanor read to him from her books, and Jack found himself fascinated by the worlds she brought to life with her voice. Slowly, carefully, Jack learned to accept physical affection again. Eleanor was patient, never pushing, always waiting for him to come to her. Each touch was a revelation. Holding hands became natural instead of terrifying. Eleanor would link her arm through his as they walked, and Jack would feel proud instead of panicked. She would brush his hair back from his forehead, and he would lean into the touch instead of flinching away. One evening, 2 months after they had arrived in Tombstone, Eleanor told Jack that she had been offered a teaching position. The town was building a proper schoolhouse, and they wanted her to be the teacher when it opened in the fall. "I accepted," she said, watching his face carefully. "I know we have not talked about the future, about what this is between us, but I am staying in Tombstone. I wanted you to know that." "I am glad," Jack said. "I am staying too. I already asked the ranch owner if I could take on more permanent work. He said yes." Relief flooded Eleanor's face. "I was afraid you might leave, that you might get scared and run again." "I am still scared," Jack admitted. "Every day I wake up and part of me wants to saddle my horse and disappear, but a bigger part of me wants to stay with you, wants to see where this goes." "I choose the bigger part." "Good." Eleanor kissed him then, a real kiss, her lips soft and sweet against his. It was Jack's first kiss in 5 years, and he felt it all the way down to his soul. When they pulled apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, the words rusty but true. "I am in love with you, Eleanor Marsh." "I love you too," she replied. I think I have loved you since you walked out of the desert bleeding and stubborn and still trying to help me instead of yourself. Summer faded into fall, and the schoolhouse was completed. Jack helped with the construction, working alongside other men from town to build something solid and permanent. It felt symbolic somehow, building something that would last, putting down roots after 5 years of drifting. Eleanor filled the classroom with slates and books, her excitement infectious as she prepared for her first students. On a cool October evening, Jack asked Eleanor to marry him. They were at their spot outside town, the place where she had first held his hand by the fire. He had no ring, no fancy speech prepared, just a heart that had learned to hope again and a certainty that had grown with every passing day. "Marry me," he said simply. "I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to be your husband and have you be my wife. Marry me, Eleanor." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married in December in a small ceremony at the church in Tombstone. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house stood as Eleanor's witness, and the ranch owner stood for Jack. Eleanor wore a simple dress of dove gray, and Jack wore his best shirt and a new vest he had bought specially for the occasion. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jack kissed Eleanor with a tenderness that came from knowing how precious and fragile happiness could be. They rented a small house near the schoolhouse, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it felt like a palace after years of boarding houses and rough camps. Eleanor filled it with curtains and books and warmth, while Jack built furniture and made repairs and learned how to be a husband again. It was not always easy. He still had nightmares sometimes, waking in a cold sweat, terrified that he would find Eleanor dead beside him. But she would wake too, wrapping her arms around him and reminding him that she was alive, that they were both alive, that they had chosen each other and chosen life. Eleanor's school opened, and she proved to be an excellent teacher, beloved by her students and respected by their parents. Jack continued working at the ranch, eventually becoming foreman when the previous one retired. They built a life in Tombstone, made friends, became part of the community. Jack had never expected to have this again, this sense of belonging and purpose. In the spring of 1884, Eleanor told Jack she was pregnant. The fear that crashed over him was immediate and overwhelming. Jack felt like he was drowning, pulled back 5 years to a frozen Colorado town and a tiny coffin he had built with his own hands. He could not breathe, he could not think. He stood frozen in their kitchen, staring at Eleanor's hopeful face, unable to speak. "Jack," Eleanor's voice was worried, "say something." "I cannot do this." The words came out strangled. "Eleanor, I cannot lose another child, I cannot bury another baby, I would not survive it." Eleanor took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You are not going to lose this baby, and you are not going to lose me. We are going to be fine, Jack, all 3 of us." "You cannot promise that." "No," she agreed. "I cannot promise we will never face tragedy or loss, but I can promise that we will face whatever comes together. You are not alone anymore, Jack." "You have me, you have us." Jack pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, his body shaking with fear and hope tangled together. "I am so scared. I know, so am I. But we are doing this anyway, because that is what courage is. Not the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it." The pregnancy was difficult for Jack in ways that had nothing to do with Eleanor's health, which remained excellent. He fretted constantly, insisted on walking Eleanor to and from school every day, brought her meals and made sure she rested. Eleanor tolerated his hovering with good humor, understanding the trauma that drove it. She let him build an elaborate cradle, let him prepare the nursery months in advance, let him work through his fear in the ways he needed to. On a warm November evening, their son was born. The labor was long and difficult, and Jack paced outside their bedroom like a caged animal, certain that history was repeating itself, that he was about to lose everything that mattered again. When the midwife finally called him in, he entered the room expecting the worst. Instead, he found Eleanor exhausted but smiling, holding a squalling, healthy baby boy with a shock of dark hair and furious little fists. Jack approached slowly, hardly daring to believe it was real. "Meet your son," Eleanor said softly, holding the baby out to him. "Meet James Thomas Thornton." Jack took his son with trembling hands, staring down at the tiny, perfect face. The baby stopped crying, blinking up at him with unfocused dark eyes. Jack felt something break open in his chest, some final wall he had been maintaining without realizing it. This was real. His son was alive. Eleanor was alive. They were a family. "Hello, James," he whispered. "I am your father. I am going to do better by you than I did before, I promise." "You are going to do wonderfully," Eleanor said. "You already are." The years that followed were full and rich in ways Jack had never imagined he would experience again. James grew into a curious, energetic boy who loved following his father around the ranch and listening to his mother's stories. In 1886, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, after Jack's first wife. Jack had wept when Eleanor suggested the name, overwhelmed by her generosity and understanding. Jack proved to be a devoted father, patient and loving in ways he had not been able to be with Thomas. He taught James to ride and rope, told both children stories by the fire, carried them on his shoulders through Tombstone's dusty streets. Eleanor would watch them together, her heart full, knowing how hard Jack had worked to get here, how much courage it took for him to love openly after such devastating loss. Their house grew as their family did. Jack added rooms, built a proper porch, planted trees that would provide shade for future generations. He and Eleanor hosted dinners for friends, celebrated holidays, became pillars of the community. Eleanor continued teaching, beloved by a generation of Tombstone children. Jack eventually bought into a partnership at the ranch, securing their financial future. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep, Jack and Eleanor would sit by the fire just as they had on that first night when she had held his hand and pulled him back into the world of the living. Jack would hold her close, marveling at the life they had built from the ruins of their separate pasts. "Do you ever regret it?" Jack asked one such evening in the spring of 1890, 8 years after they had met. "Taking a chance on a broken cowboy in the desert?" "Never," Eleanor said firmly. "You were not broken, Jack. You were healing. There is a difference. I would not have healed without you. Perhaps, but you made the choice to try. I just held out my hand. You were the one brave enough to take it." Jack kissed her temple, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I am glad I did. I am glad I stayed in Tombstone. I am glad I chose life instead of isolation. I am glad I chose you." "I am glad you chose you," Eleanor replied. "That was the hardest part, I think. Not falling in love with me, but learning to forgive yourself, learning to believe you deserved happiness again." She was right, as she usually was. The journey from that desert road to this warm home had been about more than just falling in love. It had been about learning that grief did not have to be permanent, that loss did not define him, that he was more than the worst thing that had ever happened to him. Eleanor had been his guide through that journey, patient and loving and endlessly kind, but Jack had done the hard work of healing himself. In 1892, Eleanor gave birth to their third child, another boy they named Daniel. James was now 8 and Sarah was 6, both old enough to be excited about a new sibling. The house was full of noise and laughter and the beautiful chaos of family life. Jack, who had once believed he would walk alone through the world until he died, found himself surrounded by people who loved him and whom he loved in return. He still thought about Sarah and Thomas sometimes. He still visited the cemetery occasionally, telling his first family about his second one, about the life he had built in Tombstone. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it no longer consumed him. It had become part of his story, part of who he was, but not the only part. One evening in the summer of 1895, Jack and Eleanor took a rare evening alone, leaving the children with Mrs. Patterson, who had become like a grandmother to them all. They rode out to the spot where they had spent so many important evenings, where Eleanor had first held his hand 13 years earlier. They were older now, Jack's hair showing gray at the temples, Eleanor's face bearing the gentle lines of laughter and life, but the love between them had only deepened with time. "I have been thinking," Eleanor said, leaning back against Jack as they watched the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "About that day in the desert when you found me. Do you remember what you said? You said you were not much help to anyone." "I remember, I believed it at the time." "You were wrong," Eleanor said firmly. "You saved my life that day, Jack. Not just from dying in the desert, but from living a half-life, always wondering what I was missing. You gave me love and family and a home. You gave me everything." "You did the same for me," Jack replied. "More even, you gave me back to myself. You taught me that it was okay to live again, to love again, to hope again. I had forgotten all of that before I met you. Then we saved each other," Eleanor concluded. "That seems fair." Jack turned her in his arms so he could see her face. "I love you, Eleanor Thornton. I will love you until the day I die, and probably beyond that if such things are possible." "I love you too," she replied. "Thank you for holding my hand by that fire. Thank you for staying. Thank you for building this life with me." They sat together as the stars emerged, hands clasped, hearts aligned. Two people who had found each other in the vast emptiness of the desert and chosen to build something lasting. Jack thought about the cowboy he had been 13 years earlier, wounded and alone, convinced he was meant to walk through life untouched and untouching. That man would not have recognized the person he had become, and Jack counted that as his greatest accomplishment. The years continued to pass with the easy rhythm of happy lives. James grew into a responsible young man who loved the ranch work his father did. Sarah showed her mother's love of learning and talked about becoming a teacher herself one day. Daniel, the youngest, had his father's quiet strength and his mother's kind heart. Jack and Eleanor watched their children grow with pride and joy, grateful for every ordinary moment, every scraped knee and bedtime story and family dinner. In 1898, when Jack turned 43 and Eleanor turned 40, they threw a party at their house to celebrate. The entire town seemed to turn out, a testament to the life they had built and the friendships they had forged. Jack stood on his porch, surveying the crowd of neighbors and friends, his 3 children running through the gathering, Eleanor by his side as always, and felt a sense of contentment so profound, it brought tears to his eyes. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor asked, noticing his expression. "I am thinking about roads," Jack said, "about how a different choice on any given day could have led somewhere else entirely. If those bandits had killed me instead of just wounding me, if I had gone a different direction in the desert, if I had been too afraid to hold your hand that night. Any of those things would have meant a different life or no life at all. But you did make those choices," Eleanor pointed out. "You chose to survive, you chose to help me, you chose to stay. You chose love over fear every single time it mattered. Those were not accidents, Jack. Those were choices, and they made all the difference." Jack pulled her close, kissing her soundly in front of all their guests, drawing cheers and laughter from the crowd. "Best choices I ever made." As the party continued around them, Jack thought about the 5 years he had spent wandering alone, punishing himself for a tragedy he could not have prevented. Those years felt like another lifetime now, like they had happened to a different person. In a way, they had. The man who had walked into Tombstone bleeding and broken in 1882 had been transformed by love and patience and the steady passage of time into someone new, someone whole, someone happy. He had not touched another person in 5 long years before that night by the fire when Eleanor had offered her hand, and he had finally, terrifyingly, taken it. That single moment of courage, that choice to reach out instead of pulling away, had changed everything. It had given him back his life, his heart, his future. The seasons turned, bringing 1899 and then the new century in 1900. Jack and Eleanor marked the arrival of the 20th century with their children and their community, looking forward to whatever the future would bring. James was now 16, talking about taking over the ranch someday. Sarah at 14 was already helping her mother teach, a natural educator like Eleanor. Daniel at 8 was still figuring out who he would become, but he had time. Jack had never imagined living to see a new century, much less living to see it surrounded by such abundance of love and family. He thought sometimes about writing to people he had known in Colorado, letting them know he had survived, that he had found happiness again, but the impulse always faded. That chapter of his life was closed. This was his life now, here in Tombstone with Eleanor and their children, and it was more than he had ever dared hope for. In the spring of 1902, Jack and Eleanor celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. Their children planned a surprise party, working with Mrs. Patterson and half the town to pull it off. When Jack and Eleanor arrived at what they thought was a simple dinner at the restaurant, they found instead a gathering of everyone who mattered in their lives, decorations and food and music filling the space. 20 years, Jack said later that evening, dancing slowly with Eleanor as a fiddle player provided music. 20 years since you convinced a stubborn cowboy to take a chance on life again. 20 years since that stubborn cowboy saved my life in the desert, Eleanor countered. Best 20 years of my life, Jack Thornton. Mine too, Jack agreed. Every single day of them. They danced until late in the evening, surrounded by their children and friends, celebrating not just their marriage but the entire life they had built together. Jack held Eleanor close, grateful for every moment, every choice that had led him here. He had learned that love was always a risk, that opening your heart meant accepting the possibility of loss, but that the alternative was no life at all. As they grew older, Jack and Eleanor settled into the comfortable rhythms of a long marriage. They knew each other's thoughts before they were spoken, could communicate with a glance across a room, had weathered enough storms together to trust in their ability to handle whatever came next. Their children grew into adults, each finding their own path while remaining close to their parents. James did indeed take over management of the ranch, marrying a rancher's daughter and giving Jack and Eleanor their first grandchildren. Sarah became a teacher in Tucson but visited often, eventually marrying a newspaper editor and bringing him back to Tombstone to start a local paper. Daniel, the youngest, surprised everyone by becoming a doctor, studying in San Francisco before returning home to serve his community. Jack and Eleanor watched their children's lives unfold with pride and joy, embracing their roles as grandparents with enthusiasm. They spoiled their grandchildren shamelessly, told them stories about the old days, taught them the lessons they had learned over decades of living and loving. Their house remained a gathering place for family celebrations and holidays, always full of noise and laughter and love. On a warm evening in 1910, 28 years after they had met in the desert, Jack and Eleanor sat on their porch watching the sunset. They were in their 50s now, their hair gray, their faces lined with age and laughter, but the love between them remained as strong as ever. Jack held Eleanor's hand, his thumb tracing familiar patterns on her skin, a gesture that had become so natural he did it without thinking. "I have been thinking about writing it all down," Eleanor said. "Our story, how we met, how we fell in love, how we built this life." I thought maybe our grandchildren would want to know someday when we are gone. That is a good idea, Jack said, though you will have to do the writing. My penmanship is terrible. Eleanor laughed. I will write it and you can tell me if I get anything wrong. What should I call it? Jack thought about it, his mind traveling back to that night by the fire when everything had changed. Call it what it was. I had not touched another person in 5 long years, and then you held my hand by the fire. That was when everything began. That is perfect, Eleanor agreed. That is exactly what happened. I held out my hand and you were brave enough to take it. You made it easy to be brave, Jack said. You made everything easier, better possible. I would not be here without you, Eleanor. I would not be alive in any way that matters. We saved each other, Eleanor said, repeating the words she had spoken years before. That is what love does. It saves us from ourselves, from our fears, from our loneliness. It makes us whole. They sat together as the desert sky turned purple, and the stars began to emerge, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that exceeded their wildest dreams. Jack thought about the cowboy he had been, wounded and isolated, and convinced he was meant to walk alone. He thought about Eleanor, brave and patient, offering her hand in the firelight and waiting for him to be ready to take it. That single touch had changed everything. It had been the beginning of healing, the start of a journey back to the world of the living. It had led to love and marriage and children and grandchildren, to a life rich with connection and purpose and joy. All from that one moment of courage when Jack had decided to reach out instead of pulling away, to choose love over fear, to let himself be touched again. As the years continued to pass, Jack and Eleanor remained inseparable, devoted to each other and to the family they had created. They celebrated 50th birthdays and 60th, marked anniversaries and holidays, welcomed new grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren into the world. Their house in Tombstone became a landmark of sorts, a place where multiple generations gathered, where love was the foundation of everything. Jack lived to be 73 years old, dying peacefully in his sleep in 1928 with Eleanor beside him and his children gathered close. He had lived 46 years beyond the winter that took Sarah and Thomas. 46 years he might not have had if not for a chance meeting in the desert and a woman brave enough to offer her hand to a broken man. His last words were to Eleanor, a simple, "I love you" that carried the weight of decades of devotion. Eleanor lived 3 more years, staying in the house they had shared, surrounded by family and memories. She finished writing their story, determined that future generations would know how their family had begun, how love had triumphed over grief and fear and isolation. She told their grandchildren about the cowboy who had walked out of the desert bleeding and stubborn, about the night by the fire when she had held his hand and felt him finally choose to live again. She died in 1931, at 71 years old, having lived a life full of love and purpose and meaning. Her last request was to be buried beside Jack, their graves marked with a simple stone that read, "Jack and Eleanor Thornton, who saved each other." Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered for the funeral, a testament to the life they had built together. James, now in his 40s, spoke about his father's courage and his mother's patience. Sarah read from the story Eleanor had written, the tale of 2 people who found each other in the desert and chose to build something beautiful from the ruins of their separate pasts. Daniel, the doctor, spoke about how his parents had taught him that healing was always possible, that no wound was too deep to mend with time and love and determination. The legacy Jack and Eleanor left behind was not measured in money or property, though they had provided well for their family. It was measured in love given and received, in lives touched, in the courage they had shown to reach for happiness even when fear said to hold back. Their story became family legend, passed down through generations, A reminder that it was never too late to choose life, to choose love, to let yourself be touched again after years of isolation. In the end, what mattered most was that single moment by the fire when Eleanor had offered her hand, and Jack had taken it. Everything else, the marriage and the children and the full, rich life they had shared, had flowed from that one act of courage. Jack had not touched another person in 5 long years, but when he finally let Eleanor hold his hand, he had found his way back to himself, back to the world, back to a life worth living. And that had made all the difference.